When a disheveled homeless veteran stumbled into St. Mary's Hospital clutching his bleeding arm, the ER staff made quick assumptions about another frequent flyer looking for drugs or a warm bed. Security was already moving to escort him out when Dr. James Mitchell, a renowned trauma surgeon who had seen countless patients in his 30-year career, happened to glance at the man's exposed wrist. What he saw beneath the grime and blood made every ounce of color drain from his face. The skull and wings tattoo a symbol so rare, so specific, so sacred that only a handful of men in the entire world bore its mark told a story that would change everything. As doctor, Mitchell's hands began to tremble, and his voice cracked, calling out to stop security. The entire emergency room fell silent, sensing that this was no ordinary patient, and this would be no ordinary night. The automatic doors of St. Mary's Hospital emergency room slid open with their familiar hydraulic hiss, releasing a gust of cold November air into the already chaotic waiting area. It was approaching midnight on a Saturday, the witching hour when the ER transformed into a circus of humanity's most desperate moments. Nurses hustled between curtained beds, monitors beeped their insistent alarms, and somewhere in the back, a child's cry pierced through the general din of suffering and urgency. Into this maelstrom stumbled a figure that immediately drew wary glances from the triage staff. A man whose appearance spoke of months, perhaps years, spent navigating the harsh geography of homelessness. Marcus Webb moved through the sliding doors with the careful, measured steps of someone who had learned to make himself small in a world that preferred not to see him. His clothes hung on his gaunt frame like flags on a forgotten battlefield, a military jacket that had once been olive drab but was now a patchwork of stains and repairs. Jeans torn not by fashion but by necessity, and boots held together more by willpower than by their remaining stitches. His beard was long and matted, streaked with premature grey that made it impossible to guess his true age. He could have been 40 or 60, the streets having a way of stealing years and replacing them with a hardness that settled into the bones and eyes. Cradled against his chest, his left arm was wrapped in what appeared to be a filthy T-shirt, already soaked through with blood that dripped steadily onto the linoleum floor, leaving a trail of crimson breadcrumbs marking his path from the entrance to the triage desk. His right hand pressed against the makeshift bandage, applying pressure with the kind of practiced knowledge that spoke of previous injuries, previous emergencies, previous moments when survival had hung in the balance. His breathing was labored but controlled, his jaw set in a grim line of determination that suggested he had endured far worse than whatever wound currently bled beneath the cloth. Nurse Sarah Chen looked up from her computer terminal, where she had been documenting the vital signs of the last patient, and her professional smile flickered and died as she took in the man before her. 10 years working emergency medicine had given her a sixth sense for categorizing patients in those first crucial seconds, and every alarm bell in her head was ringing the same warning. Difficult patient, possible drug seeker, likely aggressive, definitely time-consuming. She had seen dozens, hundreds of homeless individuals rotate through these same doors, many with legitimate needs, but many more looking for narcotics, a meal, or simply a warm place to sleep away from the November cold that had settled over the city like a punishing fist. "Sir, what seems to be the problem?" Sarah asked, her tone already edged with the kind of weary skepticism that healthcare workers develop as armor against manipulation and deception. She clicked her pen with unconscious irritation, a nervous habit that signaled her impatience. Marcus shifted his weight, favoring his left side, and when he spoke, his voice emerged rough and unpracticed, as though he had gone days without using it. "Cut my arm. Pretty deep. Won't stop bleeding." He unwrapped the shirt slightly, revealing a gash that ran from his wrist nearly to his elbow, the edges ragged and gaping, still weeping blood despite his attempts at pressure. The wound was clearly serious, but Sarah's eyes had already moved past the injury to catalogue other details. The smell of alcohol that wafted from him, the slight tremor in his hands that could indicate withdrawal, the defensive posture that suggested potential violence. "Have you been drinking tonight?" she asked, her fingers hovering over the keyboard but not yet typing, as if she had already decided this interaction might not warrant documentation. "Had a few drinks, yeah," Marcus admitted, his eyes not meeting hers. "But that's not the cut is real. I need stitches, maybe more. Hit an artery or something." Sarah exchanged a glance with her colleague, Nurse Rodriguez, who had drifted over to observe the interaction with his arms crossed over his broad chest. Rodriguez had been an ER nurse even longer than Sarah and had developed an even thicker skin against what he perceived as manipulation. He gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent communication that said what they were both thinking. Here we go again, another homeless addict looking for Dilaudid and a sandwich. "Sir, I'm going to need you to have a seat in the waiting area," Sarah said, gesturing toward the crowded rows of plastic chairs where other patients sat in various states of distress. "We'll get to you when we can, but as you can see, we're extremely busy tonight. We have to prioritize based on the severity of—" "My arm is cut open," Marcus interrupted, a flash of frustration breaking through his carefully controlled demeanor. He lifted the bloody shirt again, displaying the wound more insistently. "I'm bleeding. I need help." "And we'll help you when a bed becomes available," Sarah replied, her voice hardening into the bureaucratic shield that allowed her to make these decisions without feeling their weight. "But right now, we have patients with chest pain, a possible stroke, and a child with a severe asthma attack. Your wound appears superficial and can wait. Please have a seat and keep pressure on it." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, to explain that the wound was anything but superficial, that he could feel his arm growing colder as blood continued to seep away, that he knew enough about battlefield injuries to recognize when something was seriously wrong. But before he could form the words, a presence materialized beside him, hospital security, 2 guards whose body language made it clear they were not there to help but to remove. "Everything okay here, Sarah?" asked the larger of the 2 guards, a man whose name tag read Davidson and whose hand rested casually but meaningfully on the radio clipped to his belt. "This gentleman needs to wait his turn," Sarah explained, her attention already shifting back to her computer screen, the matter apparently settled. "He's becoming agitated, and I need to focus on critical patients." "I'm not agitated," Marcus said, hearing the desperation creeping into his own voice and hating it. "I just need someone to look at my arm. Please. I served." He stopped himself, swallowing the words. His service meant nothing here. He had learned that lesson too many times to count. The uniform he wore was just another piece of garbage clothing to these people. The patches and insignia, nothing but decoration on a homeless man's costume. "Sir, I'm going to need you to either take a seat quietly or leave the premises," Davidson said, his voice carrying the rehearsed authority of someone who had delivered this line 1,000 times. "The choice is yours, but you're disrupting the ER, and we can't have that." Marcus looked around the emergency room, his eyes moving from face to face, searching for an ally, for someone who might see past the exterior to the human being underneath. But everywhere he looked, he found the same thing: averted eyes, closed expressions, the invisible walls that society builds to protect itself from uncomfortable realities. The other patients in the waiting area had stopped their own whispered conversations and were watching the scene with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. He could see their thoughts as clearly as if they were written on their foreheads. Drug addict, troublemaker, probably dangerous. Why don't they just throw him out? The fight drained out of him all at once, the familiar weight of defeat settling over his shoulders like the heavy pack he had once carried through the mountains of Afghanistan. What was the point? He had been fighting against this tide of indifference and contempt for so long that he barely remembered what victory felt like. Maybe the cut would stop bleeding on its own. Maybe he could find a free clinic in the morning. Maybe he would just pass out somewhere and either wake up or not. And at this moment, he found it hard to care which outcome prevailed. "I'll go," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the ER. He turned toward the exit, his left arm still clutched against his chest, blood dripping with renewed vigor now that his heart rate had increased from the confrontation. Each drop that fell to the floor felt like a small surrender, a piece of himself being left behind in a place that had no room for him. He had made it halfway to the door when fate intervened in the form of Dr. James Mitchell, who emerged from Trauma Bay 3, still wearing the splattered gown from a messy motorcycle accident that had kept him occupied for the past 2 hours. Dr. Mitchell was exhausted, his feet aching in his surgical clogs, his mind already anticipating the drive home to his empty house, where his ex-wife's absence still echoed in every room. At 62 years old, he had seen everything an emergency room could throw at him, or so he believed. He had held dying children, sutured knife wounds on gang members, delivered babies in hallways, and pronounced death on patients whose families screamed and collapsed in his arms. Nothing surprised him anymore. Nothing moved him the way it once had. But as Marcus passed by the trauma bay, shuffling toward the exit with his shoulders hunched in defeat, something caught Dr. Mitchell's peripheral vision, just a flash of ink on skin as the makeshift bandage slipped lower on the man's arm. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, wouldn't have recognized the significance of what they were seeing. But Dr. Mitchell was not most people, and the symbol that revealed itself in that brief glimpse made his blood run cold and his breath catch in his throat. The tattoo was small, no larger than a silver dollar, positioned on the inside of Marcus's left wrist, where a watch might normally rest. It depicted a skull, but not the common skull and crossbones of pirates or the decorative skulls of popular culture. This skull was flanked by wings, intricately detailed wings that curved upward and outward, and beneath the skull was a scroll that Dr. Mitchell couldn't quite read from this distance but didn't need to. He knew exactly what it said because he had seen this tattoo only twice before in his entire life, and both times it had been on men who represented the absolute pinnacle of military service, sacrifice, and heroism. Dr. Mitchell's hand flew to his chest, clutching at his stethoscope, as if to steady himself against the sudden vertigo that threatened to topple him. His face, ruddy from exertion and warm from the heated hospital air, drained of all color in the space of a heartbeat, leaving him pale and shaken. The clipboard he had been holding clattered to the floor, the sound sharp and startling in the relative quiet that had settled over this section of the ER. "Wait, Doctor," Mitchell called out, his voice cracking with an emotion he couldn't quite name: shock, disbelief, horror at what had almost happened. "Wait. Stop that man. Security. Stop him right now." The authority in his voice, even trembling as it was, had an immediate effect. Davidson and his partner, who had been shadowing Marcus to ensure he actually left, froze in their tracks. Nurses looked up from their stations. Even some of the patients in the waiting area turned to see what new drama was unfolding. Marcus himself stopped and turned slowly, confusion and wariness warring on his weathered face. He had heard that tone before, that particular quality of voice that military men develop when something urgent is happening, when lives hang in the balance and seconds matter. Dr. Mitchell was already moving, his exhaustion forgotten, his aching feet carrying him forward with purpose and speed that would have seemed impossible moments before. He crossed the distance between himself and Marcus in long strides, his white coat billowing behind him like a cape. When he reached the homeless veteran, he didn't recoil from the smell or the grime. Instead, he reached out with trembling hands and gently took Marcus's injured arm, carefully unwrapping the blood-soaked shirt to expose both the wound and, more importantly, the tattoo that had triggered this sudden transformation. Up close, there was no mistaking it. The skull and wings were rendered in exquisite detail, despite years of sun exposure and wear. The scroll beneath read, "Mac V SOG," an acronym that would mean nothing to most people but everything to those who knew military history. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. It was a deliberately innocuous name for what had been one of the most classified, most dangerous, most elite special operations units in American military history. Dr. Mitchell's eyes moved from the tattoo to Marcus's face, really seeing him for the first time. Behind the beard and the weathering and the defeat, he could make out the bone structure of what had once been a younger man, a harder man, a man who had volunteered for missions that had mortality rates so high they weren't discussed in polite company. This wasn't just a veteran. This was a piece of living history, a ghost from a war that had tried its best to forget men like him. "Dear God," Dr. Mitchell whispered, his professional composure cracking completely. How could we? He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate the shame and horror he felt at how close they had come to throwing this man out onto the street to bleed out in an alley somewhere. He looked up at the security guards, at Nurse Sarah, who had gone pale herself upon seeing Dr. Mitchell's reaction, at the gawking crowd of staff and patients. "Get me a trauma bay right now," Dr. Mitchell commanded, his voice steady now, filled with the kind of absolute authority that comes from moral certainty. "Get me surgical supplies. Get me O-negative blood typed and crossed." And someone paged Dr. Harrison from ortho and Dr. Kim from vascular surgery. "This man needs immediate intervention, and he's getting the absolute best care this hospital can provide. Move, now." The ER exploded into controlled chaos as staff rushed to comply. A wheelchair appeared as if by magic, and Dr. Mitchell personally helped Marcus into it, his hand resting on the veteran's shoulder with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the emergency unfolding around them. As nurses rushed past wheeling equipment and calling out orders, as monitors were prepped and IV poles were positioned, Dr. Mitchell leaned down close to Marcus's ear. "I've got you now, brother," he said quietly, using the term of address he had earned through his own military service decades ago. "I'm so sorry for how you were treated. That ends now. You're safe here. You hear me? You're safe, and we're going to take care of you." Marcus, who had spent years building walls around whatever remained of his heart, felt something crack inside those defenses. His eyes, which had remained dry through countless indignities and hardships, suddenly brimmed with tears that spilled down his weathered cheeks, cutting clean trails through the grime. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and allowed himself to be wheeled toward Trauma Bay 1, the best-equipped room in the entire emergency department. Behind him, the waiting room full of patients watched in stunned silence, many of them undoubtedly wondering what could possibly be so special about this homeless man that he warranted such an extraordinary response from one of the hospital's most respected physicians. Trauma Bay 1 blazed with the intensity of a surgical theater, every light switched on to maximum brightness, casting harsh shadows that made the gleaming steel instruments look like artifacts from some sterile altar. Marcus sat on the edge of the examination table, his ruined jacket finally removed to reveal arms that told their own story, muscled despite years of poor nutrition, marked with scars that formed a map of violence survived, and decorated with additional tattoos that any military historian would recognize as belonging to a very specific, very dangerous brotherhood. "Doctor." Mitchell worked on the wound with the focused precision of a craftsman. His earlier shock transformed into a methodical determination to provide care that went beyond medical necessity into the realm of sacred duty. "This is deeper than I initially thought, Doctor," Mitchell murmured, more to himself than to Marcus, as he irrigated the wound with sterile saline, watching the water run pink and then red as it washed away layers of dried blood and street dirt. "You've got a partial laceration of the ulnar artery here, and I'm concerned about possible nerve damage. How did this happen?" Marcus was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that wasn't part of the room around him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the flat affect of someone who had learned to report facts without allowing himself to feel them. "Broke up a fight. There's this kid, can't be more than 19, stays under the overpass near 5th Street. Couple of guys were beating on him, taking his stuff. I stepped in. One of them had a box cutter." Dr. Mitchell's jaw tightened, but he kept his focus on the wound, his hands steady as they probed and assessed. "You could have been killed. Arterial bleeds like this if you hadn't known to apply pressure, if you'd passed out somewhere. He didn't finish the thought. They both knew how that sentence ended. "Wasn't worried about dying," Marcus said simply. "Been ready for that for a long time. Just didn't want to go out from something stupid like this. Figured if I'm going to check out, ought to be for something that matters." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Dr. Mitchell recognized from his own work with veteran populations. He had heard variations of this theme countless times, the death wish that wasn't quite suicidal, the reckless courage born from having already survived the unsurvivable, the bone-deep weariness that came from carrying too many memories of too many dead friends. He glanced up from his work to study Marcus's face, really examining it now that they were in proper light, and he had time to look. The man was probably in his mid-70s, though he could have passed for older given the hard living etched into every line and crease of his weathered skin. But his eyes, when they met Dr. Mitchell's, were a startling clear blue, and in them the doctor could see the young man this patient had once been sharp, alert, dangerous, in the way that apex predators are dangerous, with an intelligence that had been honed by circumstances that would have broken lesser men. "Macvisog," Dr. Mitchell said quietly, nodding toward the tattoo that had changed everything. "I know what that means. I did 2 tours in Vietnam myself, but I was just a combat medic with the 1st Cavalry. You guys, you were something else entirely. How many missions did you run?" "Ah." Marcus's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise breaking through his carefully maintained neutrality. It was rare, extraordinarily rare, to encounter someone who recognized the significance of that tattoo, who understood that it represented membership in what many historians considered the most elite fighting force in American military history. "Classified," he said automatically, the response drilled into him decades ago during briefings that emphasized the secret nature of their operations. "Of course," Dr. Mitchell nodded, accepting the boundary. "But you were operating in Laos, Cambodia, places we weren't supposed to be?" "All of the above," Marcus confirmed, his voice softening slightly. "Places that didn't exist, doing things that never happened, with people who were never there. That was the job. We'd insert by helicopter, or sometimes just walk in from the border, 12-man teams, or sometimes smaller. Our job was to gather intelligence, interdict supply lines, rescue downed pilots, and generally make life hell for the NVA and Viet Cong operating along the Ho Chi Minh Trail." As Dr. Mitchell continued working on the wound, injecting local anesthetic and beginning the delicate process of repairing the damaged artery with sutures so fine they were barely visible, Marcus found himself talking more than he had talked in years. There was something about the combination of the medical care, the first genuine kindness he had been shown in longer than he could remember, and the recognition from someone who understood, that loosened the locks he had placed on his memories. "The casualty rates were insane," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the distant quality of someone navigating the landscape of the past. "They never publicized it, but we were losing guys at rates that would have caused riots if people had known. For every 12-man team that went out, the life expectancy was measured in weeks, not months. I did 3 years with SOG, 3 years of missions that shouldn't have been survivable. Most guys who joined ended up in body bags, or listed as missing in action, left behind in countries our government claimed we never entered." Dr. Mitchell paused in his suturing, his hands hovering over the wound as the weight of those words settled over him. He had known Vietnam was hell. He had his own nightmares and his own collection of faces that visited him in the small hours of the morning. But what he had experienced as a combat medic with a regular unit was summer camp compared to what SOG operators had endured. "How did you make it out?" he asked quietly. "Luck, skill, good teammates who died so I could keep breathing," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly on the last words. "I got hit bad on my last mission, took shrapnel from a mortar round that killed 4 of my team. They medevaced me to Saigon, and while I was recovering, my unit got wiped out on an operation in Laos. All of them. The entire team I would have been with if I hadn't been wounded. After that, they sent me home. Medical discharge, with a chest full of medals they presented to me in a closed ceremony, because, officially, I had never been to the places where I earned them. The bitter irony in his voice was palpable, and Dr. Mitchell understood it instinctively. He had seen it before in special operations veterans, the disconnect between the sacrifices they had made and the recognition they could never receive, the classified heroism that had to remain secret even as they struggled with its aftermath. "And after you came home," he prompted gently, though he suspected he already knew the shape of the story. It was a depressingly familiar trajectory. Marcus laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "After I came home? That's when the real war started, Doc. At least in Vietnam. I knew who the enemy was. Back in the States, I couldn't sleep, couldn't hold down a job, couldn't be around people without wanting to hurt them or hide from them. The nightmares were so bad my wife left me, took our daughter with her. Can't blame her, I was a mess. The VA tried to help, gave me pills that turned me into a zombie, therapy that just made me relive everything over and over. I drank to forget, then I drank because I couldn't forget. Lost my job, lost my house, lost contact with my daughter. Eventually, I just sort of fell through the cracks." Dr. Mitchell had finished the arterial repair and was now working on closing the layers of tissue, his movements automatic from decades of practice, which allowed his mind to fully engage with the tragedy unfolding in Marcus's words. "How long have you been homeless? How long have you been homeless?" 15 years, give or take, Marcus said, the number emerging with the casualness of someone who had long since stopped being shocked by his own decline. "There've been times when I got into transitional housing or shelters, but I never stayed long. Too many rules, too many people. After living by my wits in the jungle, being told when I could come and go, what I could do, it felt like another kind of prison. The streets are hard, but at least they're honest about being hard. At least nobody pretends to care while they're processing you through some system designed to fail people like me." The cynicism in his voice was earned. Dr. Mitchell knew. He had seen the statistics, had volunteered at veteran homeless shelters, enough to understand how profoundly the system failed those who had served in the most dangerous capacities. "Your daughter," he ventured carefully. "Do you have any contact with her?" The question landed like a physical blow. Marcus's entire body tensed, his jaw clenching so hard that the muscles stood out like steel cables under his bearded jaw. For a long moment, he said nothing. And Dr. Mitchell wondered if he had pushed too far, crossed a boundary that would cause this fragile opening to slam shut. But then Marcus exhaled slowly, deliberately, like he was performing a breathing exercise taught by some long-ago therapist. "Sarah," he said finally, the name emerging with such tenderness that it transformed his ravaged face, allowing a glimpse of the father he had once been. "She's 38 now. Lives in Seattle, works as a software engineer, has 2 kids I've never met. I see her sometimes on social media, when I can get to a library and use their computers. She doesn't know I look. Why would she? Last time she saw me was 20 years ago, at her college graduation. I showed up drunk, made a scene, embarrassed her in front of all her friends and professors. She told me she never wanted to see me again, that I had already ruined enough of her life. I haven't contacted her since. What would I even say? Sorry I chose booze and self-pity over being your father? That doesn't fix anything. It just makes her have to deal with my guilt on top of everything else." The raw honesty of the admission hung in the sterile air of the trauma bay, more powerful than any confession Dr. Mitchell had ever heard. He continued suturing, giving Marcus space to continue or retreat, whichever felt safer. After a moment, the veteran went on, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I keep the watch," Marcus said, gesturing with his chin toward a pocket in the jacket that had been placed on the nearby chair. "It's the only thing I have left from before. She gave it to me when she was 7 years old, saved up her allowance for months. It doesn't work anymore. The crystal is cracked. but I've carried it every single day since she put it in my hand and told me she loved me. When things get really bad, when I'm sitting under a bridge somewhere in February wondering why I don't just walk into traffic, I take out that watch and remember that once upon a time, I was someone's hero. Not because I ran black ops in Cambodia, but because I was her dad and she thought I hung the moon. Dr. Mitchell had to pause in his work. His vision blurring with tears, he blinked away rapidly. In 30 years of emergency medicine, he had developed what he thought was an impenetrable emotional armor, a necessary defense against the parade of human suffering that passed through his department. But something about this man, this warrior who had survived the most classified and dangerous operations in American military history, only to be nearly turned away from an emergency room like a piece of trash, had broken through every defense he possessed. "Marcus," Dr. Mitchell said, using his name for the first time, having seen it on the tattered military ID card that had fallen from his jacket pocket. "Marcus Webb, I want you to listen to me very carefully. What happened to you tonight, how our staff treated you, how close we came to sending you away, that's on us. That's on me. Because I trained some of these nurses, I set the tone for this department, and clearly, I've failed to instill the values that should guide every medical professional. You deserved better. You've always deserved better. From the country you served, from the systems that were supposed to support you, from every person who walked past you on the street and looked away." He set down his instruments and looked directly into Marcus's eyes, making sure the veteran could see the sincerity in his expression. "I can't fix everything that's broken in your life. I can't give you back the years you lost or repair the relationships that were damaged. But I can tell you this. Starting right now, you're not alone anymore. Once I finish with this wound, and it's going to heal properly, I'm making sure of that we're going to have conversations, real conversations, about what comes next. I know people at the VA, good people who actually give a damn. I know housing programs specifically for special operations veterans. I know therapists who specialize in PTSD and traumatic brain injury. And I'm personally going to make sure you're connected to every resource you need." Marcus stared at him, his expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and fear in rapid succession. "Why?" he asked finally, the single word containing multitudes of questions. "Why now? Why me? Why should I trust that this time will be different? Because I've spent my entire career saving lives, but somewhere along the way, I forgot that saving a life isn't just about stopping the bleeding or restarting the heart," Dr. Mitchell said. "It's about seeing the person in front of you as a complete human being worthy of dignity and respect, not just a set of symptoms to be treated or problems to be solved. You reminded me of that tonight. You reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place." He returned to his suturing, his movements careful and precise, taking extra time to ensure that the scar would be as minimal as possible, that the function of Marcus's arm would be fully preserved. As he worked, other staff members had begun filtering into and out of the trauma bay, drawn by word, spreading through the ER about what had happened, about who this patient really was. Nurse Sarah Chen appeared in the doorway, her face stricken with guilt and shame. "Dr. Mitchell," she said hesitantly, her voice small and chastened. "I just wanted to say, I'm so sorry. There's no excuse for how I treated Mr. Webb. I made assumptions based on appearance, and I nearly—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the magnitude of what could have happened too terrible to articulate. Marcus turned to look at her, and something in his expression softened. "You're busy. You see a lot of people trying to game the system. I get it. I don't blame you." But Dr. Mitchell was less forgiving. "Sarah, I appreciate your apology, but I want you to think very carefully about what happened here tonight and what it reveals about our protocols and our culture. This man is a decorated veteran who served in one of the most dangerous units in American military history. But even if he wasn't, even if he was just a homeless person with no military service, no dramatic backstory, no special qualifications, he still deserved to be treated with basic human dignity and to have his medical emergency assessed properly. We're going to be having a department-wide meeting about this, and we're going to be implementing changes to ensure it never happens again." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face now, and quietly withdrew. Marcus watched her go, then turned back to Dr. Mitchell. "You didn't have to be so hard on her." "Yes, I did," Dr. Mitchell replied firmly. "Because if we don't learn from this, if we don't change our systems and our attitudes, then what happened to you will keep happening to others. And I won't be responsible for that. None of us should be." The suturing was nearly complete now, neat rows of stitches closing the wound that had been so close to ending Marcus's life. As Dr. Mitchell worked on the final layer, he made a decision that would change both of their lives irrevocably. "When was the last time you had a real meal?" he asked. Marcus had to think about it. Define real meal. Sit-down restaurant. Multiple courses. Food that wasn't expired or out of a dumpster. "Years," Marcus admitted. "Probably 5 years, at least." "Well, once I'm done here and you're stable, we're fixing that. There's a diner 2 blocks from here that's open 24 hours. They make the best breakfast in the city. You and I are going to sit down, have some coffee, eat some eggs and bacon, and talk about what happens next. No pressure, no judgment, just 2 veterans sharing a meal and figuring things out. What do you say?" Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in so long that he almost didn't recognize the emotion. Hope. It was fragile and tentative, like a candle flame in a draught, threatening to extinguish at any moment. But it was there, warming a part of him that had been frozen for decades. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "I'd like that a lot." The fluorescent lights of Pete's all-night diner cast a warm, almost nostalgic glow over the red vinyl booths and chrome-edged tables, creating an atmosphere that felt suspended outside of time, a refuge from the harsh realities waiting beyond the large plate-glass windows. It was nearly 3 in the morning, that liminal hour when the city held its breath between yesterday and tomorrow, and the diner hosted its usual collection of night shift workers, insomniacs, and people who had nowhere else to be. Marcus sat across from Dr. Mitchell in a corner booth, his injured arm now properly bandaged and immobilized in a sling, a prescription for antibiotics and pain medication folded in his jacket pocket. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, a scent so achingly normal that it made Marcus's throat tight with emotion. The waitress, a woman named Betty, who had been working this shift for 20 years and had seen everything the night had to offer, brought them 2 enormous platters of food without judgment or comment on Marcus's appearance. Scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, hash browns, toast slathered with butter, and mugs of coffee so hot that steam rose from them like smoke signals. Marcus stared at the plate in front of him, overwhelmed by abundance after so much scarcity, unsure even where to begin. "Go ahead," Dr. Mitchell encouraged, picking up his own fork. "It's real, and it's yours. Nobody's going to take it away." Marcus picked up his fork with a hand that trembled slightly, partly from hunger and partly from the sheer improbability of this moment. The first bite of eggs was a revelation. Salt and butter and protein combining in a symphony of flavor that his deprived taste buds could barely process. He had forgotten that food could taste like this, that eating could be something other than the joyless consumption of calories necessary for survival. He ate slowly at first, savoring each bite, then more quickly as his body reminded him of just how long it had been since he had eaten anything substantial. Dr. Mitchell watched him eat, sipping his own coffee and taking occasional bites of his breakfast, but his attention was primarily focused on the man across from him. He had questions, so many questions, but he understood intuitively that this moment needed to be about more than information gathering. This was about establishing trust, about proving through action, rather than words, that his promises of help were genuine and sustained. "Tell me about your team, Doctor," Mitchell said finally, when Marcus had made significant progress through his plate and the edge of desperation had left his eating. "The guys you ran missions with. You mentioned you were close." Marcus set down his fork and leaned back in the booth, his eyes focusing on something beyond the diner's walls, beyond the present moment, reaching back through time to grasp memories he usually kept locked away. "There were 12 of us in the primary team," he said softly. "We rotated personnel sometimes when guys got wounded or killed, but there was a core group of 6 who ran together for almost 2 years. That's an eternity in SOG terms. Most teams were lucky to last 6 months before they were decimated." He picked up his coffee mug, wrapping both hands around it as if to draw warmth from the ceramic. "Our team leader was a captain named Derek Hayes. Harvard graduate, could have done anything with his life, but he volunteered for the most dangerous duty he could find because he believed in the mission. He died in Laos in 1969, walked point into an ambush that was meant for all of us, threw himself on a grenade to save the rest of the team. They gave him a Medal of Honor, but it was classified for 20 years. His family was told he died in a helicopter accident." Dr. Mitchell absorbed this, the casual revelation of heroism that could never be properly acknowledged, sacrifice that had to remain secret. And the others? Tommy Chen, best point man I ever knew, could smell an ambush before you could see it. He made it home but ate his service pistol in 1973. Nobody knew how to help guys like us back then. PTSD wasn't even a diagnosis yet. They just called it being weak or crazy. Marcus's voice was flat, reciting facts without allowing himself to feel them, a necessary dissociation from pain that would otherwise be unbearable. "Mike Rodriguez, our radio operator, saved our lives a dozen times by calling in air support or extraction under impossible circumstances. He's in a VA nursing home in Florida now. Doesn't remember his own name most days. Agent Orange gave him early onset dementia." The litany continued, each name a monument to a particular kind of loss, a specific variety of survival that looked like living but felt like dying. Jackson, Williams, Peterson, Kowalski, all gone. Car accidents, overdoses, suicides, diseases that the VA claimed weren't related to service, even though we all knew better. Out of that core group of 6, I'm the only one left. The only one who made it this far. And look at me. I'm not even sure "made it" is the right phrase for what I've been doing. Dr. Mitchell set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, the ceramic clicking against the Formica tabletop with a finality that drew Marcus's attention. "You survived," he said firmly. "Against odds that should have killed you 100 times over, you survived. That matters. It matters to me, and whether you believe it right now or not, it's going to matter to other people too." "What people?" Marcus asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "The daughter who hasn't spoken to me in 20 years? The society that walks past homeless veterans every day without a second glance? The government that sent us into countries we weren't supposed to be in and then pretended we were never there when we came back broken?" "Your daughter," Dr. Mitchell said quietly, and the 2 words hung in the air between them like a challenge and an invitation simultaneously. "When's the last time you actually tried to contact her? Not just looked at her social media, but actually reached out?" Marcus's jaw tightened, his entire body tensing defensively. "I told you, 20 years ago. She made it clear she wanted nothing to do with me. 20 years ago, you were a different person," Dr. Mitchell countered. "You were in active addiction, unable to manage your trauma, probably barely holding yourself together from one day to the next. What if things are different now? What if you approached her not as someone asking for forgiveness or trying to restart a relationship, but simply as a father who wants his daughter to know he's still alive and thinking of her?" "And say what exactly?" Marcus's voice rose slightly, drawing a glance from the only other occupied table in the diner. "Sorry, I was a disaster of a father, but hey, I'm homeless now, and a doctor bought me breakfast, so everything's great?" "That's not a conversation. That's just me dumping more pain on someone who already suffered enough because of my failures." Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, his voice intense but compassionate. "What if you wrote her a letter? Not to send, not immediately, but just to put on paper everything you'd want her to know. The apology she deserves. The explanation for what happened to you, Not as an excuse, but as context. The pride you feel watching her succeed from a distance. The grandchildren you've never met but think about constantly. Write it all down, and then we'll decide together whether or not to send it. The suggestion caught Marcus off guard, and he found himself considering it despite his initial resistance. There was something appealing about the idea of being able to organize his thoughts, to craft words carefully, rather than blurting them out in the midst of emotional turmoil. "I don't even know if I remember how to write," he said. But it was a weak protest and they both knew it. "You remember," Dr. Mitchell assured him, "the same way you remembered how to assess your arterial wound and apply pressure to keep yourself alive. The training doesn't leave us, even when we wish it would. You were trained to operate behind enemy lines, to make decisions under fire, to survive against impossible odds. Writing a letter to your daughter? That's nothing compared to what you've already done." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, pushing hash browns around his plate with his fork, his expression cycling through emotions too complex to name. Finally, he looked up and met Dr. Mitchell's eyes. "What's your stake in all this? Why do you care what happens to me after tonight? You fixed my arm. You bought me a meal. That's already more than anyone's done in years. Why keep pushing?" It was a fair question, and Dr. Mitchell had been anticipating it. He set down his coffee cup and folded his hands on the table, choosing his words carefully. "Because 23 years ago, my son died. He was 19, a Marine, killed in Somalia during an operation that most Americans don't even remember happened. When they sent him home, I was still married, still functional, still had a career and a support system. And even with all those advantages, even with all my medical knowledge and professional connections, I nearly didn't make it. The grief almost destroyed me. It did destroy my marriage. For years, I was just going through the motions of living while feeling dead inside." Marcus watched him, recognizing the landscape of loss being described, understanding it in his bones. "What changed?" "Another veteran," Dr. Mitchell said simply. "A patient who came into my ER one night, a Vietnam vet having a heart attack. While I was working on him, he looked up at me and somehow, he just knew. He knew I was carrying something heavy, and after we stabilized him and he was recovering, he told me his story. It was similar to yours in a lot of ways: trauma, addiction, loss, homelessness. But he'd found his way back, with help from people who refused to give up on him. And he told me something I've never forgotten. The only way to honor our dead is to help the living." He paused, his voice thickening with emotion. "My son is gone. I can't save him, can't bring him back, can't undo the fact that he died in a desert on the other side of the world doing his duty. But I can save you. I can help you find your way back to some version of life that doesn't feel like just counting down the days until you die. And in doing that, I honor both my son and all the guys on your team who didn't make it home. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded slowly, his own eyes bright with tears he refused to let fall. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "Yeah, I think I do." They sat in silence for a while, the comfortable quiet of two people who understood each other on a fundamental level, who had both walked through fire and come out the other side scarred but still standing. The diner's ambient sounds, the hiss of the grill, the murmur of late-night conversation from other tables, the clink of dishes being washed provided a gentle soundtrack to their contemplation. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked finally. "I walk out of here and what? Check myself into rehab? Find a shelter? Apply for disability I should have gotten 40 years ago?" "All of that, eventually," Dr. Mitchell said. "But first, you're coming home with me. I have a guest room that hasn't been used since my daughter visited 3 Christmases ago. You'll stay there tonight, get a shower, sleep in a real bed, and then tomorrow we start making phone calls. I've got a friend who runs a program specifically for special operations veterans dealing with PTSD and homelessness. He's former Delta Force, understands the specific challenges guys like you face. We'll get you connected with him, get you into proper housing, Start the process of claiming the benefits you're entitled to. Marcus started to protest, to list all the reasons why this wouldn't work. Why Dr. Mitchell would regret this kindness, why accepting help was somehow a betrayal of the self-sufficiency he had maintained even in his worst moments. But the words died before they reached his lips, because somewhere deep in his exhausted, traumatized soul, he was tired of fighting, tired of pretending he didn't need help, tired of wearing pride like armor when all it had ever done was isolate him further from the human connection he desperately craved, but had convinced himself he didn't deserve. "Okay," he said simply, the two syllables containing multitudes of surrender and acceptance and hope that terrified him, even as it offered the first real possibility of redemption he had felt in decades. "Okay, I'll try. I can't promise I won't screw it up or that it'll work, but I'll try." "That's all anyone can ask," Dr. Mitchell said, signaling Betty for the check. As he paid for their meal, leaving a generous tip that made the waitress smile, he made a decision that would alter the trajectory of both their lives in ways neither could fully anticipate in that moment. The ride to Dr. Mitchell's house passed in comfortable silence, Marcus watching the city slide by through the car window, seeing it from this new perspective of possibility rather than mere survival. The neighborhood where Dr. Mitchell lived was quiet and affluent, with well-maintained lawns and houses that spoke of stability and success, a world that felt impossibly distant from the underpasses and alleys that had been Marcus's reality for so long. Inside the house, Dr. Mitchell showed Marcus to the guest room, providing clean towels and toiletries, explaining where everything was with the practical efficiency of someone accustomed to caring for others. "Showers through that door. Take as long as you want, the hot water heater is huge. There are some of my old clothes in the closet that might fit you. They're from when I was younger, and actually worked out regularly, so they should be closer to your size than my current wardrobe." Marcus stood in the doorway of the guest room, taking in the space that would be his for the night. The queen-sized bed with its clean sheets, the dresser with a mirror, the window with curtains that suggested peace and privacy rather than exposure and vulnerability. It was almost too much to process, this sudden transition from sleeping under bridges to sleeping in what looked like a room from a magazine. "Dr. Mitchell," he started, not even sure what he wanted to say, how to articulate gratitude for something that went so far beyond the medical treatment or the meal. "James," the doctor corrected gently, "after everything we've shared tonight, I think we've earned the right to first names. And Marcus, you don't have to say anything. Just get some rest. Tomorrow is soon enough to start figuring out the next steps." But Marcus needed to say it, needed to push past the years of silence and emotional lockdown to express something true. "You saved my life tonight. Not just the arm, not just the bleeding. You saw me when everyone else looked away. You reminded me that I'm still human, still worth saving. I don't have words for what that means." James Mitchell smiled, and in that smile was understanding and recognition and a shared knowledge of how close the margins can be between life and death, between despair and hope, between being lost and being found. "Get some sleep, Marine. We've got work to do tomorrow, but tonight, you're safe. You're home." Marcus closed the door to the guest room and stood alone in the silence, his injured arm throbbing despite the pain medication, his body exhausted to the point of collapse, his mind spinning with too many thoughts and feelings to process. But underneath it all, buried deep beneath the layers of trauma and loss and survival, something small and fragile stirred to life. It would take time, he knew. It would take effort and courage and the willingness to be vulnerable in ways he hadn't allowed himself to be in decades. There would be setbacks and struggles and moments when the old patterns would call to him with the seductive promise of familiar numbness. But tonight, in this moment, standing in a guest room in a house that belonged to a man who had chosen to see his humanity rather than his homelessness, Marcus Webb allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over, that the tattoo on his wrist, the symbol of missions survived and brothers lost, could become something more than a mark of past glory and present shame. It could become a reminder that survival wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of the next chapter. He moved to the window and looked out at the quiet suburban street, seeing the first hints of dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Somewhere out there, his daughter was sleeping, unaware that her father was alive and thinking of her. Somewhere out there, other veterans were struggling through their own darkness, fighting battles that would never make the news or earn medals. And somewhere out there, the sun was rising on a day that held possibilities he had thought were forever beyond his reach. Marcus touched the tattoo on his wrist, feeling the raised skin of ink and scar tissue, remembering every mission, every friend, every moment that had brought him to this impossible present. Hayes, Chen, Rodriguez, he whispered, naming his ghosts, honoring his dead. I'm still here. I'm still standing. And tomorrow, I'm going to try to do more than just survive. That's the best I can offer, but it's yours. It's all yours. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the heating system and the distant sound of Dr. Mitchell James moving around the house, preparing for bed. Marcus turned away from the window, toward the shower that promised to wash away more than just the physical dirt of the streets, and took the first step forward into whatever came next. The road ahead would be difficult. He knew that with absolute certainty. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, difficult didn't mean impossible, and that made all the difference.